There is a painting of the head of Christ that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, or anyway, those of us of a certain age, as the case is so delicately stated. As a matter of fact, that is what the painting is called. Warner Salmon was the artist, and the painting is called The Head of Christ. The painting was completed and published in 1940, just before the start of World War II, and it had an immense impact upon the faithful of that generation. For one thing, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines carried pocket-sized versions of that portrait in their wallets. It gave them real spiritual sustenance in the savage and murderous battles that raged over the islands of the Pacific and across France and Europe during World War II. I remember Kathy and I bought a car from a Chevy dealership where we were living back in the 80s, and when Kathy told him she was studying for the ministry, the salesman, a man of that generation, took out his wallet and showed us just such a reproduction and said that he had carried it every day during that war and since. Long, long ago, not quite as long ago as 1940, not as long ago as the 80s for that matter, but the years do add up, in a little church on the near west side of a prominent city far, far to the east of here, where we sit this morning, there was quite unexpected church fight over a reproduction of this very painting. In this particular church, right up front and center on the altar, where in most Protestant churches there is a plain wooden cross, there was a full-size reproduction of Warner Salmon's Head of Christ. It had resided and presided there since who knew when. It was a church attended and carried through hard times and good times by faithful members of that GI generation that had carried copies of Head of Christ in wallet, rucksack, and duffel bag during those years when democracy almost died, when fascists tried to take over the planet and very nearly succeeded. That painting was venerated. Okay. That was then, this is now, some younger members of that little church started to think and say, including the younger anyway, pastor of that church. It's not 1945 anymore, they said. This is not the same world that it was in 1945, not the same city, not the same church. This neighborhood and the people that live in it, the people we're trying to reach, don't look anything like the young man in that painting. What are they going to think when the first thing they see when they walk in this church, up there in a prominent place, the most prominent place in the church, right up there overlooking the very altar where the cross is supposed to be, where a cross usually is this portrait of, let's face it, a young white man who is supposed to be God. Some there are in our day and age who profess to be mortally offended by that picture. He's got blonde hair, he's got blue eyes. We know that the real Jesus was an undocumented person of color. Does that portrait really reflect who we are as a church? Does it reflect who we're supposed to be? What do you say we take that portrait down and replace it with a plain cross? Well, this was an old church building. There was no central air in that old building. There were fans used to circulate the air when it got hot. Fans. One might have sworn that something struck those fans at right about that time, and I'm just going to leave that observation right there. Suffice it to say that members of that generation did not remotely resonate with the sound as brickwork logic of those youngish or younger folks. There were meetings, letters were written. This was before emails and texts had become the thing that they are today. There were phone calls, ad hoc committees were formed. There were meetings. Oh my Lord, were there meetings? Feelings were hurt. People were scandalized. I was a member of that church at the time. As a matter of fact, I was one of the strident young people who just know that that portrait didn't exactly represent the people of the neighborhood. I don't exactly remember the details as to the compromise eventually struck. It's been a while, and there might be some low-level PTSD that renders memory inexact. But Head of Christ ended up in a prominent place right up to the right on the wall to the right, and a cross was put up at the center of the altar. But I want to leave all that to the side for a moment and consider this quaint biblical text that Regina read for us this morning, which dealt with this weird issue from way back thousands of years ago about meat sacrificed to idols. I mean, really, what does that have to do with us? What are we doing today that amounts to eating meat sacrificed to false gods? Or more accurately, what are we doing that some Christians think is tantamount to eating meat sacrificed to a false god or worshiping a false god, while others of us say it's no big deal? The Wesley Study Bible points out that the conflict here is between the freedom that accompanies knowledge and the obligation of love. And it should be said that the love we're talking about is the kind of love that we are obliged to practice, whether we want to or not. This is not a romantic kind of love that one falls into as if against one's will. Quite the opposite. It is love that is an act of will, not a love that we do, a love that we do whether we feel particularly inclined to or not. We are called here to do nothing less than choose love over freedom. And what knowledge allows as perfectly ethical, love forbids as sin, since it could destroy the weak brother or sister. That's a quote again from the Wesley Study Bible. One tendency is to see the relevancy of this today in terms of hot-button issues, abortion, alcohol use, smoking. But that's not quite what we're dealing with here, though I suppose in some instances it could be. But there are always going to be disagreements about things like that, both in secular and religious settings, and people do have a right to their own convictions. But what constitutes meat sacrificed to idols in our day? Where do we see this conflict enacted even today? An idol amounts to making something out to be sacred or holy that is material, profane, secular, making something out to be God that is not God. But what shall we make of something that is truly sacred to some and has some of the characteristics of the sacred for some, while for others it's just a distraction? In a case like that, how do we move forward? Perhaps it has to do with how we want to see our church. Do some of us view some forms of worship as in some way idolatrous, worshiping tradition rather than that to which tradition points, or worshiping change simply for the sake of change? What constitutes sacred space, and what is just space for everyday use? A group may want to pile canned goods for the hungry in front of or even on the altar. But that is holy ground, others might say, so disrespectful. Now, we know that tile is just tile, flooring is just flooring. Some is no more holy than others, but for the weak, like me, it really is sanctified ground. That is the altar where my mother prayed, and they want to tear it out and rebuild some kind of contemporary thing. It's just a painting that is no longer appropriate for the times. I carried that picture next to my heart during the Battle of the Bulge. We know that music is just music. What difference does it make if it's by Bach or Taylor Swift? What do we know? How do we love? What we are told here is that knowledge makes people arrogant, but love builds people up. Who is the prophet like Moses that God will raise up from out of that community of the Israelites? Of course, there are many levels and shadings of disagreement about this, but our tradition says that this prophet is Jesus. He is the one we must listen to. What is his witness telling us? What are the words that God has put in his mouth? And what are they saying to us today? What questions is he raising among us today? And where is he calling us to go as we look to the horizon? What new land is he calling us to? What lies ahead? What must we leave behind to get there? One person's meat that has been sacrificed to a false god could be another person's communion or close to it. Knowledge makes people arrogant. Oh boy, does it. But love builds people up. And this is one of our goals. As a matter of fact, it is the matrix that presides over all of our goals. Not knowledge, though knowledge is good, but love. The love that builds up. This is our current goal, and one we need to carry into the future. What is the love that builds up? What is the love that will build this church and make it evermore the presence of Jesus Christ right here on the corner of Detroit and Summit? What might we have to sacrifice for such a building up? What do we, by God, know that we might have to set aside for the sake of building up, for the sake of including those who might not think like us, all those who might not look like us, think like us, see the world and the church as we see it? It isn't what we know that's important, it's how we love. Let this goal carry us as we ponder an unknown future. What do we know? How do we love? That was the question. That still is the question. That will always be the question. It doesn't have a simple answer. Conflicts like the one over meat sacrificed to false gods, like the one over one man's impression of the face of Christ, are not over. They never will be. What I can say is that conflict at that church on the near west side of Cleveland passed, as conflicts always do. History is still history. Back when Cleveland was still young, when all of us sitting here today hadn't been born yet, that church, that space was used for the work of the building up of Christ. In the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, in that space, there were Hope Methodist Church and Wesley Methodist Church and a Methodist church named after a prominent family named Peoples. Over the decades, Hope and Wesley merged and became Hope Wesley Methodist Church, and then merged again with Peoples Methodist Church and became Peoples Hope United Methodist Church, where in the early 90s my wife Kathy was pastor, and where our conflict over Salmon's Head of Christ took place. That conflict passed, as conflicts always do. But the work of Christ is still being done in that space, sacred space, secular space, holy space, or profane space, whatever. That space is being used right now, as much as ever, even now as I speak, to do the work of Jesus Christ in the city of Cleveland. It is the place we now know as the Nehemiah Mission. So perhaps our question, The question for Lakewood United Methodist Church for today is, what is our Nehemiah mission future? I am not for one moment suggesting, no one is, that we shut down and radically repurpose ourselves. Let me say that again. I am not for one moment suggesting, no one is, that we shut down and radically repurpose ourselves. As a matter of fact, that's projected on the screen. Could we all read it together? I am not for one moment suggesting, no one is, that we shut down and radically repurpose ourselves. Thank you very much. There will be stations at the exits with affidavits that we'd like you to sign, saying that you read and understand, you've read and understand that statement. But where might the Spirit be leading us? Into what perhaps completely unknown place as we look to an unknown, and let's face it, somewhat forbidding future? What kind of church do we want to be? What kind of church is the Spirit of Jesus Christ leading us to be? That's the question for all as we look beyond the horizon, as we offer up for Christ's use our worship and ourselves. Amen. Let us pray.